Well, Paul, it's so lovely to have you with us this afternoon. Just for those that don't know who you are, would you give us an introduction, who you are, what's your full name?
Sure, thanks Jessie. So my name's Paul Hassan. I work for an organisation called Locality that supports strong and successful community organisations across the country. I'm their Southwest Development Manager and I'm primarily based in Bristol. We work in a range of activities from policy shaping to community asset transfer, etc. The other hat I've got on is as a board member of United Communities Housing Association, and I've been a board member there for about the last 4 years.
So can you tell us a little bit about, you've obviously been in the social housing sector for a while in Bristol. Would you take us on a little bit of a journey and tell us what you've been involved in and how you got involved and what led you even to be a board member at United Communities?
Absolutely. So I've been in and around the community development sector and economic development in Bristol for about 30 years or so, I guess now, looking back to the late 80s. I've also had a role in community media and spent some time as well in digital as well as the sort of policy environment. So it's been quite a sort of mixed bag really, I guess. In terms of social housing, I've always been passionate about it. I mean, I grew up in a council estate and in a kind of social housing environment myself, and from a very early point, that's always been important to me to ensure that that everyone really has got access to the right type of housing, regardless of the income they've got. So from that point of view, it's been an early passion. I was involved from about the mid to late 80s in an organisation called Positive Action Training in Housing. So that was set up in the wake of the inner city disturbances in the early 80s. In Toxteth, in Handsworth, in Brixton, and also in St Paul's in Bristol. And along with a suite of other initiatives, it was a real attempt to try and tackle the fact that there was a real racial inequality and imbalance in the workforce that was much clearer, because obviously in terms of the a disproportionately higher number of people of colour were represented as residents. That was in no way reflected in the actual staff in both RPs as well as the council services. And
for those that don't know anything about the Uprising, can you explain a little bit about the root of those and how that affected the positive action movement?
Sure. So I think as a consequence of a lot of government policies, particularly around austerity, what we saw during the period of the sort of early 80s was a huge rise in unemployment, and that was particularly pronounced amongst black communities. There was also a real issue around racism within the police force. There were a number of real high profile issues where individuals were feeling that they were being targeted. There were a number of pernicious sort of legal methods the police were using, namely sus, amongst other things really, which was really about giving the police the ability just to arrest without necessarily any reasonable suspicion. And what we found is that those mechanisms were used disproportionately against black males in particular. So that, combined with all of the other impacts of institutional racism, unemployment, the lack of really being able to navigate any other areas of housing and the social space, etc., started to cause fairly sort of deep-seated resentment, and that just exploded over the summer across the early 82, 83 basically, just led to inner city disturbances, which led to effectively rioting and sort of standoffs with the police and with the authorities during that time. I think the reaction after that was actually that there's really something here that needs to be addressed. I mean, Michael Heseltine was one of the ministers at that point, and he was chosen to lead a sort of an inner city task force, basically to look specifically at what are these fundamental problems. And out of that discussion really came the fact that one of the things that really needed to be addressed was this real issue around inequality in employment, which is one of the responses to that was the setting up of these path initiatives.
And you mentioned positive action, so that the creation of that within Bristol. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that looked like, what that did, what that achieved, and your role within that as well?
So it was obviously it was something which was taken from a legal statute from the Race Relations Act 1976, which gave employers the opportunity to be able to take some targeted training where there was a clear market failure in terms of the workforce not being representative of the community was there to serve. And many people confuse that with positive discrimination, and it certainly was not positive discrimination. It was action as in a time-limited intervention there. And the idea was to really address a range of issues, as well as training and support. It was also the other issues that were coming out. There were a consequence of institutional racism, which was the lack of networking opportunities, the opportunity to really start to have some sense of what a kind of long-term career might look like in housing, and support around those things as well. So I was involved with colleagues at the time in just devising that programme, very much with the support of the Federation of Black Housing Associations, as well as colleagues in other parts of the country. And initially the programme started to address the issue of the disparity at the level of housing management, but that moved into technical areas like surveying, but also housing development, etc. over time. And my role was really facilitating that, supporting the overall structure, working with and negotiating with the local authority and the housing associations at that time to take an active part in that programme, and support creating the right sort of space for the positive action trainees themselves to have their voice. We had what we called a trainee forum, where they also played a really important role in co-producing what the trainings were, but also talking about the barriers and issues that they were facing within their workspace, and providing a space for them to as a bit of support, but also as an opportunity to learn and tackle particular problems any of them were facing. At that time, actually, I was working with Asha Craig in 1988, and she was very much a community activist and was one of the early voices to set up the Malcolm X Community Centre. Again, it was another one of the invested products after the St Paul's Uprising. So it was great to work with Asha back then, and we had some particularly visionary people who were very supportive of that work as well. Haroon Saad, who worked at the city at that time, is now working internationally in the field of economic equality, and also Seiji Tokolia as well, who again is now doing some really interesting work in the education sphere. So it was a really good political space to be in, and a good social space to be in. You had some good people there. You had people like Mike Robinson, who was the Director of Housing, who was a bit of a visionary, supported the decentralisation of housing with his deputy Roy Irwin, who went on to become the director, and was very, very supportive of what we were trying to do there. So yeah, it really felt like it was a co-produced effort. It felt like there was an awful lot of support from key people who were working within social housing, who were really committed to seeing this change come through, as well as people at the top. So that was, I think, all those things were key ingredients in making it a success.
It definitely feels like Bristol's been very, it's taken a very strong leadership role when it's been looking at the way that it engages with housing. It's, as we've looked back as the Housing Festival to pull together the materials that are now available for the Expo, we've noticed there's a real kind of strategic leadership, and there's a real kind of creative, innovative edge as we look at Bristol and its past and the way that it's engaged with affordable and social housing. And obviously you mentioned the setting up of the Malcolm X Centre and the positive action movement, but are there other key elements in the recent past within Bristol that you think are worth paying attention to and of note that you've experienced or heard of or seen the repercussions of?
I put the ingredients to why housing innovation is being particularly had a great space in Bristol, down to probably 3 ingredients. I think the first is you've had the right type of people in place who are real social innovators and were really prepared to think the unthinkable and just drive through change. So I'm just thinking of people like Guy Reed-Bailey, obviously, who also plays a key role in the Bristol bus boycott in the 60s, but also was then founding father of United Housing Association that's become, United Communities, and hopefully through the Strategic Alliance become something even bigger again. You've had people like Paul Boulevant who set up Bristol Churches Housing Association, again a real social innovator and somebody who was willing to draw up partnerships and to to tackle issues of mutual concern. And people like Don Murphy set up the Self-Help Housing Association, became chair actually of Solon Housing Association. People like Aileen Edwards, who worked in a really pivotal role in East Bristol youth housing and went on to do some great work with Second Step, and obviously through some of the partnerships that have emerged from that. So that was really important. And I think, as I've alluded to in that as well, I think the spirit of partnership, collaboration, cooperation is key. And talking to colleagues in other cities, in the other core cities, that's not always the case. There is, I think that level of willingness to collaborate and to cooperate is a very, very strong part of this. I guess the final bit of the mix for me really is there doesn't really seem to be much of a fear of failure in Bristol. I think in a lot of places people maybe will be looking over their shoulder to see, okay, if I do this and it falls flat, what will people think of me, my organisation, etc. I don't feel that's there in Bristol as much. I think in people like Una Goldsworthy and others Paul Smith, who just march on, and I've got obviously quite a strong belief in what they do. And also people like Dom Wood I can think of as well, really who have just got a vision of what they want to achieve, and are less worried about the fact that this might not work, and are more focused on really pushing out the thing they want to achieve as far as it can go. And I think when you put those three ingredients together, it does really create this very vibrant, creative space where innovation thrives.
So you've got the key people, the strong leadership and the fearlessness. Is that the three elements? And I think that's right. And we're starting to see that even now in present day, aren't we? We've got very strong leadership in certain housing associations, in our Bristol City Council as well, within WECA. You've got key people in key positions and a courage in leadership as well there. Are there particular things that you're seeing happening now, very presently, that you're most excited about or particularly watching with interest?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess there is a massive challenge in Bristol, isn't there? It is a city that has got a housing crisis of pretty large proportion. There's still something like 13,000 people on the home choice list, and just not enough property coming through the system. So you have got this huge crisis basically there in the city. And I think there are a number of things really which give me a kind of some optimism that is something that we will conquer over time. I think certainly the political leadership within Bristol City Council, from the Mayor and from Councillor Smith and others, has been exemplary. I think that real single-minded determination to, regardless of the barriers faced by local authorities, to just crack on and deliver high-quality housing, social housing, council housing, that is really, really strong, and that gives me great cause for optimism. I think the innovation there, things like the Z-Pods and the Launchpad, etc., just thinking about a little bit more flexibly about how we can tackle the issues to do with getting the right sort of mix of people, particularly young people in terms of Launchpad, how you could create housing which is relatively easy to put up but still robust, high quality, and a great comfortable place to be. So that thinking is going to continue, and some amazing partnerships have come out of that which are great. I think there's some of the work that We Can Make have done up in Mill West. I think again really drilling down and looking at what is the problem we're trying to solve here, and then being able to just drive that through. Melissa Mean, I think, has done an amazing job there in terms of then identifying, okay, not only is this the housing problem, and many organisations might just sit on their laurels, identifying the research and then pass that on for someone else to do, but then for them to go to the next step to say, and now we're going to build it, and now we're going to drive that forward, I think is fantastic. Again, I think similarly you've seen in Southmead the partnership they've had around Glencoyne and some of the other developments there has been really gives me a real sense of optimism, positivity, and Ambition. Lawrence Weston actually have done some amazing stuff with Astrey Close as well, which has been which obviously still having challenges, but I think that is really of great sort of makes you feel that actually we can really move forward here. I think I particularly like the fact that the community-led housing hub as well is up and working really well, and it really feels like there's a real pipeline of support coming through that work as well. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff happening on the margin. I in no way am I trying to detract from this major challenge around numbers, and it is really difficult to do that. But I feel that there's the right mix of people, the right organisations in place to really start to see that problem properly addressed over the next year or so.
So, Paul, in that context, what do you see as the role of a social housing provider within that, looking at all those exciting things that are happening? What is the role of a housing association?
I'm being on the board of one at the moment. I'm conscious that just keeping the show on the road is really tough. Obviously, like a lot of businesses and like a lot of sectors, COVID has provided a whole series of additional challenges in terms of how we run our services, how we keep that relationship with our tenants, how we service repairs and maintenance. So I think there's a real challenge, and lots of boards, and I know we're having this conversation at United Community as well, are really having to do some really deep thinking to work out what is the right model to make that happen. So, I think that's the first thing to be aware of. For me also, I think there is a challenge, and I know it's coming out, in the conversations at the Housing Festival as well as nationally, around how registered providers, how housing associations can also go back to their roots in terms of social impact. They all grew out of challenge and out of a particular deficit, whether that was United in the context of BME housing, Solon in terms of some of the particular challenges that were coming out in terms of the communities they were seeking to serve. And I think there is something really important about how housing associations find a way of connecting back to that social spirit that drove a lot of them, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, etc. Totally understand that we're in a completely different space in terms of the market and in terms of the commercial pressures on organisations, and obviously a huge number of regulatory pressures emerging. Not least what's coming out of Grenville, and I think there is an issue there around not just the thing that people focus on, which is building and safety. I think the one massive thing coming out of the Hackett review is voice of residents and resident engagement. And I think there is a challenge to all housing associations that, as well as becoming really efficient, effective businesses with very strong boards, with commercial acumen, which is absolutely essential, and understanding of treasury and some of those long-term challenges, they also have to be places that can really provide a space for residents to articulate their needs and to ensure the resident voice is front and centre. So as well as getting their own house in order, I think there also is an opportunity around partnership with community organisations. Again, United Communities and Solon showed that through the Coronavirus Fund that we ran quite recently over the summer and invested in a number of community organisations. St Paul's Adventure Playground, St Werburgh's, one of the Somali youth organisations, Youth Concern, and it was great to be able to do that. But what's come out of that conversation is it's more than just providing small but essential bits of funding. There is also an opportunity to do some co-production, to work with those community organisations as well.
It's really interesting, and you picked up specifically on kind of the role of communities in that, and obviously the funds that United Communities and Solon have put into some of those projects to build and support communities. It's one of the things the Housing Festival is really interested in. It's not just the physical building of houses, but how communities are built and how communities formed and how communities stick together through difficult things as well as through good things, and what makes a healthy and resilient community as opposed to one that is not healthy and is not resilient and can't withstand these different things. And where have you seen, perhaps presently, but perhaps in the past, where have you seen really good examples of communities being formed and grown, where they've come together, where groups of people have come together and there's been a real kind of output of something that you can kind of highlight as that's a really strong community, that really stands out?
Yeah, I think, again, Bristol is blessed with a number of examples of communities and community organisations that have almost against the grain just done done the things that they needed to do. And it's I think in the 70s the community organising space used to call such organisations the Bristol model. They actually got national traction as a model and a way of thinking. So the Barton Hill settlements and of this world, and the work done up at the Southmead Development Trust as well, very much seen as a way of working and thinking. Basically, there was unique to Bristol. And obviously, we had then movements like victim support, which emerged from Bristol. The SOFA projects and a number of the other initiatives that have gone on to become like nationally recognised organisations. Sustrans being another one, etc. Soil Association. There's so many basically. Brilliant. And it's been a real hothouse for that thinking and development. I think in terms of a neighbourhood-based sort of space, I think it's worth looking at. Something like Ambition Lawrence Weston, what they've managed to do there, I think is immense, really. I mean, the vision, obviously, a lot of it is down to individuals. There, Mark Pepper, Denise, and others have done an amazing work in terms of just getting the community with them, developing a community plan, really knocking on virtually every door on the estate to get that engagement. That's the first sign of whether people actually answer the door and want to talk to you. Secondly was then when that community plan was done, and one of the top requests was for a supermarket in that area, and despite the city council not being particularly cooperative at the time, they managed to just drive that through, and eventually a supermarket was established there. And then you build confidence. People will say, okay, it's worth putting some effort into this because these people really mean business, and that then starts to kind of build. And currently now you've got obviously ambition around housing, to build more housing. At the moment there's a partnership with United Communities. There's work around a kind of wind turbine, which I think is going to be one of the largest on-land wind turbines, which has been a labour of love there, but that's coming through. And that is a really interesting model because that's about not just about finding a long-term sustainable way to support community organising in the context of grants for being disappearing potentially in the future, obviously increasing pressures on local authority notwithstanding COVID, but also about tackling the need for a low carbon economy and for the city, the target of wanting to be carbon neutral by 2030. So I think there's some ingredients there around engagement, confidence, delivering, and then vision, basically. I think there is examples of that in Knoll West as well, in terms of not just the individual work of organisations like the Health Park, Filbert Community Centre, the Media Centre and others, but also their recognition of the need to just come together and collaborate, not necessarily to merge into one thing, but to recognise that each of those organisations have got individual strengths, and to work with those strengths through the Knoll West Alliance, and that's been remarkably successful as well. And that again has not been something easy. There were some real challenges there in that state, so I think that's really interesting. Southmead is another example. I think again they led a community plan process, again knocking on virtually every door in Southmead, building then a high degree of trust and confidence. In the old school, it was the Greenway Centre that became the sort of space, the main sort of headquarters of the Development Trust, and now are leading some sort of fairly significant regeneration and investment programmes. So, I mean, there's three, and there's so many more examples I can give you in Bristol, and we've got limited time, but I think if I was just to think about what are the ingredients that make those communities so vibrant, there's a combination of things. There's got to be a kind of a real community pride and community spirit. That's got to be there. There's got to be then some of those key individuals who can stoke that community pride and spirit, because that isn't always going to rise. There's got to be then that real sense of shared endeavour and ambition to really want to get things done, even if the odds are really against them. And when you think of those three areas there in the most deprived parts of Bristol, you haven't got the whole range of social assets and economic resources you might have in other parts of the city. So there are particular challenges there. But when all of those things are marshalled together, you see some real magic happening. And I think there are three examples. As I said, I could give many more. And yeah, it's really great to see Bristol when you look at the challenges in other core cities in England, across the UK, they're really having something quite special there in terms of the resilience and the strength and that level of independence and self-confidence those community organisations bring to their neighbourhoods.
Bristol definitely is one of those places where there is lots and lots to talk about, and I know we could talk all afternoon, couldn't we, about all the different elements in Bristol. But as a final question, Paul, looking ahead to the future, what are you most excited about? What are you looking at and seeing ahead in the future for Bristol, and what do you think the role of the Housing Festival should or could be within that context?
So I think there is going to be a lot more. I'm just thinking in terms of the future, what's happening next. I think there's clearly some huge opportunities in terms of the technical side of house building, and I think we're getting better and better at that, not just internationally, but in the UK there's some amazing models. In fact, the first time I came engaged with the Housing Festival was the exhibition of some of the modular housing which is already pretty groundbreaking, and I think it's really exciting to see houses really built quite quickly but of a very high spec that are zero carbon, that can really are really built for the types of communities and for the people who want to use them. So I think in terms of the future, seeing that growing, seeing Bristol being very much a base for that to grow, and I think the Housing Festival is a really great arena in space, not just for that discussion, but sends a real message that actually for people who really want to innovate in housing, Bristol is the place to be. So those two things come together, I think, well. There is an opportunity, I think, as well, linked to that really, around how we deal with the medium to long-term challenge of the care home scenario. And again, I think there were already some questions around how effective that model was. COVID again has thrown some big challenges around how secure and how much that is really going to be a destination for people when they reach the age they're going to struggle to have independence. So I think the idea of a lot more flexibility around better lives at home and supported housing and getting a domiciliary care service that really works, linked to possibly micro villages. Again, community-led housing and house building projects can really start to address that. So elders can then live with a bit dignity in their communities with that support, but possibly in small groups within us. So I think that's quite an interesting space and discussion to be had. I just think as well that there's got to be a new kind of campaign, a broad campaign, which isn't just linked to any one political party, about how we can start to really address this massive crisis around the quality of social housing, or the lack of capacity and quality issues within housing. I think there are some really serious questions around how effective the rental sector is. There's certainly big capacity issues for that as well. So I think there's got to be some ambition of how a kind of almost going back to the 40s Homes for Heroes discussion, to think about what does that look like, and are we also looking to build in new ways, linking communities, maybe designing communities that are maybe smaller in hyper-local or in smaller neighbourhoods, basically. So there's quite a lot of some interesting thinking to be done in that space. And I think the Housing Festival is now, I think it's been interesting how it's moved from a festival that its main focus was really around the sort of the technical side of housing, into recognising, as we all recognise, I think it was implicit, obviously, that housing and social housing is about people, basically, as
Absolutely.
well. And really bringing that element of the equation in. So the opportunity to do a lot more co-production work with communities and community organisations, so they get to be really front and centre of designing the estates and the space around them, and also play major parts in terms of new building projects that the city is going to lead through Gorham and the other spaces. And the final thing I would say to that really is that we don't forget the importance of having community infrastructure as part of that. And this isn't just a question of building housing units, it's about building homes, and homes have to also have a sort of community infrastructure at the start. So that's a really, really key issue as well.
Yeah, they really do. They really do. Well, Paul, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It's been great to catch up with you. I wish you all the best, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessie.